Let's clear it up, because I really want this to be correct. Yes? You said. We're going to interrupt this program for a special bulletin. We will pause for a moment first to let our other stations around the nation join us.
I'm Peter Jennings at ABC News headquarters. We have heard just a couple of minutes ago that President Nixon may have died, and we emphasize that is a rumor at this point. We say so because President Clinton has decided he's going to come to the White House cameras in a very short period from now and make some statement, and virtually all of our sources say that it has to do with President Nixon. But as soon as we're able to confirm that for you, we will be right back.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
We return now to 2020 in progress. Minister Farrakhan is very convincing in expressing his beliefs, but we checked on his claims about AIDS and crack, and I'd like to tell you what we found. Expert researchers and sociologists not associated with the government say that crack was already deeply entrenched in major U.S. cities prior to Minister Farrakhan's 1985 speech, and that the principal agent of its distribution was not the U.S. government, but illegal.
This is a special report from ABC News. Now reporting from New York, Peter Jennings.
We're now absolutely able to confirm that President Nixon has died here in New York City. He died at 9:08 p.m., 37th President of the United States, one of the most controversial political figures in the post-war period. He was 81 years old. We have believed for many hours that death was imminent. Let's go to New York Hospital, where Bob Jameson is standing by.
Peter, officials here at New York Hospital, where the president has been in the intensive care unit since Tuesday, confirmed that he died at 9:08 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, which is about an hour and 20 minutes ago. The officials issued a very simple one-paragraph statement which said that he died as a result of the massive stroke which he suffered on Monday at his home in New Jersey. You will remember that he was brought to the hospital here from that home in New Jersey, and for a while on Tuesday it was felt he was getting better. But then he was returned to the intensive care unit after his condition apparently stabilized because of massive swelling in his brain, which was a complication of the stroke, an ominous sign that is considered one of the most feared complications of a stroke. He fell into a deep coma yesterday, and by most accounts, his condition deteriorated steadily, and death had been considered imminent all day long. The only thing we can add at this point is that his family, at least his daughters, Tricia Nixon Cox and Julie Nixon Eisenhower, were with him at the time of the death. We also believe that Mrs. Cox's husband, lawyer Edward Cox, was with them. We do not know about Julie Eisenhower's husband, David Eisenhower. From here, what happens next, we are not quite certain, although we are waiting to hear what President Clinton says in the announcement, but it is believed that after some sort of mortuary procedure here, that the former president will be taken back to New Jersey, which has been the state of his residence for some time.
Jameson at New York Hospital. We'll go back there as things develop. Remember that Pat Nixon, the president's wife, died only last June, and the family has been here in New York, as Bob Jameson said. We believe they went out for dinner a while ago, but as we said, this has been pretty much expected for much of the day. Not going to tell Americans anything most of you don't know at the moment. Some people loved and respected Richard Nixon. Some hated him. Very few were indifferent. He was one of the most controversial American political figures of the century. As we said, his career began in controversy, and it never changed when we look back.
He was a public figure on the American political stage for nearly half a century. Richard Nixon accomplished great goals in foreign policy. He was the only president to resign in disgrace from office. He was born in Yorba Linda, California in 1913, the son of Quaker parents. Having worked his way through college and law school, in 1940 he married Patricia Ryan. 2 years later he went into the Navy. In 1946 the country was preoccupied with communism. Richard Nixon ran for Congress. he accused his Democratic opponent of being soft on communism. He won. Arriving in Washington, Nixon got a seat on the House Un-American Activities Committee, coming to national attention during the investigation of the State Department official Alger Hiss.
In penetrating to the bedrock of the facts relevant to the charge which you have publicized.
In 1950, he ran for the Senate, and this time he accused his opponent Helen Gahagan Douglas of being soft on communism. She accused him of Nazi tactics, but he won. He was in the Senate at 37. Only 2 years later, the Republican leadership chose him to be Dwight Eisenhower's running mate in the presidential campaign. But soon reports surfaced of a secret fund given to Nixon by wealthy California contributors. Leading Republicans questioned his usefulness to the ticket. But in a dramatic television speech, Nixon took his case to the people. He denied taking money. He did say he had accepted one gift.
You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas. Black and white, spotted. And our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, named it Checker. And you know, the kids, like all kids, love the dog. And I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it.
After the Checker speech, he got 1 million telegrams of support, and it saved his place on the ticket. On January 1953, he and President Eisenhower were sworn in. 7 years later, having been one of the country's most visible vice presidents, he ran for the presidency against John F. Kennedy. In the first nationally televised presidential debate, Nixon appeared nervous and defensive. He blamed poor lighting and a bad makeup job, and he lost the election, though it was very close. 2 years later, Nixon ran for governor of California and lost again.
Just think how much you're going to be missing. You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore. Because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference.
Not by any means. In 1968, Richard Nixon was back, and in 1969, he was president.
Having lost a close one 8 years ago and having won a close one this year, I can say this: winning's a lot more fun.
It was a bad time for America. Vietnam, student demonstrations, and the defining trauma of the Nixon presidency, Watergate, an illegal break-in for political gain, and a cover-up that went all the way to the top. After more than a year, Watergate brought him down.
Including primarily the president, that the whole story of the Watergate should be made public.
While he continued to struggle at home, no one can deny Nixon's success abroad. An historic reopening of relations with China after almost 30 years. The beginning of a new and fruitful strategic arms reduction process with the Soviet Union. An end, finally, to the war in Vietnam. The brief history of one of America's most controversial politicians. And finally, the first president ever to resign from office.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Under threat of impeachment by the Congress, Richard Nixon resigned. He said goodbye to his White House staff in the East Room.
Always give your best. Never get discouraged. Never be petty. Always remember, others may hate you. But those who hate you don't win unless you hate them. And then you destroy yourself.
You heard me say in the middle of that was the short history of what we will forever call one of the most controversial politicians in the post-war period. There is so much to be said about Richard Nixon, and all across the country tonight, I must tell you, through various electronic points, people are streaming in to reminisce about this man who, if you look at the China visit there, paid 5 visits to China and 10 visits to the Soviet Union. One of the first people to join us this evening to talk about Richard Nixon's political impact on the country, political and social impact as well, is Hal Bruno, who's ABC's political editor now. He's in Washington. During Richard Nixon's presidency from 1969 to 74, Hal, you were the chief news editor for Newsweek in Washington. Richard Nixon didn't like you very much. Before you plunge straight into Watergate, give us your first thoughts when he died. You knew it was coming.
Sadness, Peter. Richard Nixon accomplished a lot in his political career. You mentioned some of them there in that piece. Opening the door to China, easing the tensions with the Soviet Union, peace in Vietnam. He had a sophisticated knowledge of foreign policy. And here was the cold warrior who turned into a very masterful diplomat and brought a lot of good to the world. On the domestic front, he was very successful as a president. And the tragedy of Richard Nixon is that most of all, he's going to be remembered from Watergate. I'd also like to correct one thing, Peter. Actually, when he began his comeback in 1966, I traveled with him and got to know him pretty well. And he liked me very much at that time, and I liked, respected, and admired him. It was only because of my involvement in the Watergate investigation. From that time on, I never was able to talk to him again.
President Nixon himself once said, Hal, of course, that he would always acknowledge that he would be known as the disgraced former president because of Watergate. Is your own guess that history is always going to have that label on it, or will somehow his impact on China and his contribution to ending the tension with the Soviet Union will overwhelm it at some point?
I don't think it'll overwhelm it, Peter. I think all of those things will be mentioned, and he will get the credit he deserves for the historic role he played. But always there is going to be the blot of Watergate, because there never has been anything like that in our political history. It was the massive abuse and misuse of presidential power, and the result is he became the only American president who had to resign in office.
Also joining us now, someone else who knew Richard Nixon well and interviewed him many times, Barbara Walters. Barbara, it is your program with Louis Farrakhan that we interrupted this evening. Talk a little about the Richard Nixon you knew.
Well, I covered him so many times when he was in the White House. He was an uncomfortable man. He wanted to reach out and be friendly, but he never could somehow make one-to-one relations. Had very few close friends, although he was beloved by his 2 daughters and 4 grandchildren. He was able to have the intimacy with them. I feel, Peter, when I listen to Hal talk, that perhaps his finest time was really after Watergate. Most men would have given up. I don't know how they would have gone on. This man had humiliation, a very serious illness, and yet behaved with respect and discretion, didn't seek the limelight, never went back to the White House, and through his writings and through his knowledge of foreign policy, won the respect of people who had really felt that he had disgraced the presidency. He had a new book about to come out. As a matter of fact, we were going to do an interview with him in 2 weeks.
Let me ask you this. Do you think...
Let me just say one little thing about the book. What I find very touching about the book, which has not yet come out, is that it is dedicated to Patricia Ryan Nixon, the goodwill ambassador. That's so much on his mind, that relationship with his wife, and we think of this now at his own death.
Well, it is just about a year ago now. Do you think that in these final years he had come to terms with the legacy to which everybody will ascribe?
He refused to look back. He never complained and he never explained. He did say in an interview that we had done that he was sorry that he hadn't burnt those tapes. But again and again he said, I'm going to go forward, I won't look back. Look, it was always there. But by his own intelligence, by traveling all over the world, you know, he was, as you know, Peter, he still was welcome wherever he went in the world. He'd just been to Russia recently. He went back and forth to China so many times. He continued to live his life as a man who respected himself, and I think most of us ended up feeling that way about him.
We have a report, we have a piece that Barbara prepared earlier about her reminiscences. We're going to come to that in a moment, but I think it's probably only fair, particularly for our younger viewers. One's appraisal of Richard Nixon has a fair amount to do with not only, as Barbara said, where you lived in the world, because people in other lands just did not have that sense of impact that people in America did at the time of Watergate, but also how old you are, because there's so many Americans now who weren't politically aware, to say the least, at that particular time. So here is a little bit of Watergate from our reporter, Jim Wooten.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
He'd heard the words before, and the music too. His second inauguration, a capital moment in his long career, for by January '73, he'd crafted promising new ties to China and to the Soviet Union, and the Vietnam War, that great gash in the American body politic, was at last winding down. Richard Nixon seemed happy and hopeful.